Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. Buckle up because today I am giving you a laundry list of homework book recommendations. A few months ago, I did an episode where I shared my top 10 book recommendations that I most often recommend to parents or gift to people. And while we covered a lot of ground, there were a bunch of titles that I think are very important that did not make it into that episode. So today we're doing round 2 of books that I think every parent should read. Any of my friends who have been to my house know that I have huge piles of books on education. I have shelves of them in my home library. I have not read all of them. I have read a number of them. And we're going to go through a few of my favorites today. The first book on the list is Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich, which, if you look at the title, you can probably tell right away why I'm a fan of this one. In the first episode on book recommendations, I talked about Dumbing Us Down by John Taylor Gatto, which is a scathing critique of the public school system and one of the top books I always recommend that parents read if they're curious about how to think about educating their kids. Dumbing Us Down talks about how the public school system is teaching our kids a whole slew of negative lessons, not through its academic curriculum, but through the structure of the system itself. It's teaching kids to be passive, to look for the approval of authority figures, to take their self-esteem from their class rank. And it talks about why the structure itself is so detrimental to our kids, but also to society. And this book is in a similar vein. It was written in the 1970s, and it's about how damaging psychologically the public education system is to our kids and to our overall society. Just listen to the very first sentence on the back cover. Schools have failed our individual needs, supporting false and misleading notions of progress and development fostered by the belief that ever-increasing production, consumption, and profit are proper yardsticks for measuring the quality of human life. Oof. This book is amazing if you are interested in how to think deeply and philosophically about the structural harms that institutional education is doing to society. This book is a must read. It will blow your mind. Book number 2 is an absolute classic in the alternative education space. Honestly, it's kind of a tragedy that this didn't make it on the first list, and that is 100% my fault, obviously. How Children Learn is one of the early texts in the alternative education movement. It's a classic in how kids thrive best when they're allowed space to freely explore, to freely play, to follow their interests. It argues that kids are hardwired to naturally acquire knowledge, and that in many cases, an adult's best job is to open up their ability to chase their curiosities, to play, to have real world experiences that allow them to go through the natural process of absorbing knowledge rather than being stuck in a classroom all day that makes them hate learning and fights against their natural proclivities to learn. It goes through all different forms of learning, everything from different methodologies like running experiments and playing games through to different types of things or categories of things that kids need to learn, things like how to talk and how to read. And it breaks down the process of how kids do these things naturally and how so many of the systems that we've tried to mass engineer just get in the way. This book is a really fun read. It's full of amazing examples and anecdotes, and I highly recommend every parent who wants to facilitate a child-centric education for their kids or who's on the fence and wants to be convinced. This book is fantastic. Book number 3 is Unschooled by my friend Kerry McDonald. Kerry is a prolific writer documenting both the unschooling movement and the microschool movement. And in this book, she covers everything you could possibly need to know about unschooling. She talks about the history of the unschooling movement and the history of the public education movement and why public education is so broken and why it has been from the beginning. And she talks about what unschooling actually is in practice and how parents go about delivering an unschooling experience. She talks about why unschooling is primarily a learner-driven education modality and why the kid and their curiosity is and should be in the driver's seat of an education, and what it looks like in practice for parents to be facilitating a learner-driven education where their kids' curiosity is the compass, not some standardized curriculum or some set of expectations about what a child should be learning at a certain age or grade level. And she goes through all the different practicalities of what a parent actually needs to be thinking about to deliver this type of education, whether it's thinking about setting up guardrails or thinking about how to encourage their child or thinking about how to provide resources in a way that's not top-down and totalitarian. This book is a really easy read. It's super informative. And if you're interested in unschooling, this is a really helpful primer to get you started. Book number 4 is The Discovery of the Child by Maria Montessori. I recommend this book a lot because I have a lot of conversations with people about Montessori. And when I asked my Montessorian friends what book they thought someone should start with if they want to get an overall primer on the Montessori philosophy, this is the book that was most often recommended to me, and now it's the book that I most often recommend to others. This book is a fantastic primer into how Montessori thought about the mind of the child and the development of a child and how her educational philosophy was built around those core understandings of the nature of a child. If you walk into a Montessori classroom, you can see right away how revolutionary her ideas were because they are still revolutionary 100 years later. And Montessori was way ahead of her time. But in this book, she breaks down both the history of her method and how she began to develop the Montessori approach that is still used in classrooms all over the world today. But she also talked about how she thought about kids, which is the part of this that's really, really interesting and I think most useful to parents, no matter what sort of education philosophy they intend to pursue with their kids, because she talks about the innate desire in a child to learn. Are you sensing a theme here between these different books I'm recommending? The innate desire of a child to learn and their innate curiosity, and the fact that those things did not need to be created or forced in a child, but that it was a naturally occurring energy or resource that merely needed direction. And that direction in a Montessori classroom is created through environment. If you walk into a Montessori school and you go into a classroom for students who are 3 to 6 years of age, so a typical children's house, and you go in during a work cycle, which is the point during the day where kids are working independently, each one is focused on a task. They're not being interrupted by an adult. They're not being interrupted by each other. They're just focused and they're working. You'll see the magic of her approach immediately. You will see children working with a level of focus and a level of self-direction that if you only ever spent time in public schools, you would not think a child is capable of. And they're doing it with a level of passion and joy that makes it obvious how deeply personally invested they are in the work they're doing. And in this book, Maria Montessori explains how she developed her philosophy over time and how she structures her learning environments to create that sort of energy and spirit in the kids that she's working with, which is not necessarily an actual creation, but rather a preservation of something that already exists that most educational philosophies take for granted or ignore altogether and inadvertently crush. Amazing read. Highly recommend. Book number 5 is The Last Safe Investment by Michael Ellsberg, who I have had on the podcast about a year ago. This one might seem like an unexpected recommendation because it's not about education, it's about careers. But I think this is a book that every parent should read because it changes the frame on what the game is we're even playing when we're thinking about educating our children. The whole point of an education is to prepare your child for real life. And so the question you have to ask is, what is the life that my child's being prepared for? And what does success in that life look like? And much of conventional education frames the whole answer to that question around getting into a good college. And if you succeed in a good college, you'll be set up for life, which, if you look at the stats, is absolutely not true. But that's the game that most conventional education is playing. And this book turns the whole question on its head and says, look, we're living in a world that's changing extremely rapidly. And many of the careers that we're working in now did not exist when we were in school and probably won't exist anymore by the time we're retiring. And the rate of change is accelerating. So we can't predict at all what kinds of jobs our kids are going to be growing up and working in, let alone how those careers will evolve over the course of the 40, 50 years that they're in the workforce. This book talks about the idea of thinking of your career through the lens of investments. And the idea is that really the only safe investment that you can make, the last safe investment, is yourself, because you are the resource that is going to be changing and evolving and continuing to allow you to be valuable in the workforce and make money over the course of your career. And so it breaks down the types of investments that you can make in yourself that are most evergreen, most enduring, and most transferable, even as the world around you is changing. When I worked at Praxis, I probably personally ordered like 300 or 400 copies of this book to send to every single incoming student into our program, because this was required reading as part of the curriculum, because we thought it was such an important book for college-age kids to be reading as they were starting their careers. But I think this is a book that every parent should read no matter what, because it's such a great frame shift to stop and think about the things that are actually going to matter over the course of your child's career and how to make sure you're measuring their education in the right ways, even if their education isn't necessarily built around helping them develop these soft professional skills that they'll be carrying into the workforce. Just thinking about what types of things are actually going to matter in the day-to-day life of your child when they're 25, 35, 45 is such a deviation from the norm of how we think about your child's success when they're in the 4th grade and the things that they're supposed to be studying. And I think it's a really helpful shift for parents to think about. And I think it puts the whole game in perspective in a way that most traditional education books just don't. Book number 6 is Why Johnny Can't Read and What You Can Do About It by Rudolf Flesch. So in the last video on book recommendations, I talked about a book called Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Write or Do Math and What We Can Do About It by Andrew Bernstein, who I've had on the podcast. And this book is the book that book is playing on with its title. This book was written all the way back in 1955. And it's about why in the 1950s we were having a literacy crisis and why so many children were struggling with reading, and why this illiteracy epidemic could be traced back to teaching kids to read via the whole word method, or the look-say method, which is where you teach children to recognize a word on the page by sight rather than deconstructing it and sounding it out using phonics, which is the cheat code to allow you to read any word in the English language and other languages besides, even if you've never seen it before. In the 1950s, Rudolf Flesch wrote a book on why the whole word method was preventing our kids from learning how to read, and why phonics is the most effective way to teach kids to read, and how parents could teach their kids using phonics. This book is a great primer on how phonics works and how to think about teaching it to your kids, but it's also great historical context, because all the way back in the 1950s, we had evidence that proved that kids needed to learn phonics if they were going to be able to read well and effectively and anything that they wanted to, even if it used words that they'd never seen before. And we ignored that. And we continued to teach kids to read in the public education system, primarily through the whole word method. In the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, into the 90s, we were teaching kids exclusively using the whole word method. And even when we started reintroducing phonics, it was still through a hybrid method that combined phonics with whole word and word recognition. And it wasn't until the 2010s, and honestly, really the 2020s, that states started making policy shifts to pivot to using phonics instruction in classrooms, and school districts started making pivots to change their curriculum to a phonics-based approach. I think this book is so important because it's such eye-opening context that we can know for decades the best way to educate kids and still somehow manage to refuse to implement it at scale for our kids. And if we can be incorrectly teaching our kids to read at scale across the country for decades, what else do we know about how kids learn that we are willfully ignoring at a systemic level? If you read this book, I think it will empower you to read some of these other books on the list and say, just because the system is ignoring these doesn't mean it's not true, because Rudolf Flesch was sounding the alarm bell on our literacy crisis in the 1950s and nobody paid any attention until 6 decades later. It's also just a fun book on how literacy works and how phonics works, which if you learned how to read via the whole word method, you'll probably find it really interesting. Book number 7 is The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt had another book come out a couple of years ago called The Anxious Generation about the social media epidemic that made huge waves. And this book made similarly large waves in 2018 when it came out. And it's an exploration of a cultural phenomenon, both in and out of our classrooms, that Jonathan Haidt argued was setting an entire generation of kids up for failure. I'm going to read you the very first line in the dust jacket because it paints the whole picture. Something has been going wrong on many college campuses in the last few years. Speakers are shouted down. Students and professors say they are walking on eggshells and afraid to speak honestly. Rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide are rising on campus as well as nationally. How did this happen? And the book is an attempt to answer that question. But while it focuses heavily on college campuses, it's true for every age bracket, and it's true of the cultural milieu at large. I think this book is important to read, not just because it poses really important questions and has really interesting content that parents should be considering, but because on a deeper level, similarly to how Why Johnny Can't Read by Rudolf Flesch challenges parents to question the system at large, I think this book challenges parents and challenges society to shift the Overton window of the questions we're even asking. And I think it challenges parents to critique the culture at large that is educating our kids and that is making democratic decisions about what should be talked about in classrooms and what isn't okay societally for us to be engaging in. And I think it challenges parents to say, wait a minute, just because the culture at large is moving in this direction does not mean this is good for my kid, and does not mean that this is how I want my family culture and the trajectory of my child to be moving. And if you want to design an education for your kids and design a life for your family, I think that's a set of questions that you have to be willing to ask. Just because the culture is doing something, do I want to be doing it too? And do I want my kid to be exposed to it? And I think this book empowers parents to think in those terms, but also gives them a really great contextual perspective on what it looks like if you just follow the status quo and why maybe that isn't always the best choice for you and for your family. It's also just a good read. It's really well written. It's honestly pretty entertaining as long as you don't take it too seriously, in which case you might find it kind of depressing. But I enjoyed reading this, and I suspect that you might as well. Book number 8 is The Self-Driven Child. Compared to some of the other books on this list, it's not necessarily a revelatory set of ideas. It's about why kids should be in the driver's seat of their education and why it is good for their development, their psychology, but also for their academic outcomes for them to be in the driver's seat of their learning experience. It draws on psychological research. It draws on learning science to make these claims. So it's very substantive from a data standpoint, but it's also full of anecdotes of what it actually looks like for a child to be living out on a day-to-day basis a self-directed education and what that child's experience is like. If you have not been exposed to self-directed education before, this book is revolutionary. I think it was for a lot of parents who encountered it as their red pill into the alternative education world. This is one of the top recommended books from Alpha School, the school in downtown Austin that doesn't have any teachers and where the kids spend 2 hours a day on their academic work and then spend the rest of their day working on projects of their choosing. This book is recommended to every parent there, and for good reason, because it really encapsulates the philosophy and the spirit that Alpha is running, but also that so many other alternative schools are building their kids' educations around. It really captures the ethos of the movement, but it gives you a lot of data and a lot of hard science to back up a lot of these ideas, which can be really helpful if you are arguing about self-directed education with naysayers in your life who think they have an opinion on how your kid ought to be educated and don't believe you when you say that unschooling has worked for many, many kids and they want data to back it up. This book is a good one to pull out of your back pocket or maybe even gift to some of the skeptics in your life. Book number 9 is Changing Our Minds by Naomi Fisher. I had the absolute pleasure of having Naomi on the podcast about a year ago. She is an absolute delight to talk to. She's been deep down the rabbit hole of alternative education for a long time. She moved to a different country so her kids could go to an innovative school, which is a crazy level of commitment for your children's education and one that I find highly commendable. But Naomi is a clinical psychologist, and her book, while again covering a lot of the themes that many of the books on this list do, about how kids are full of curiosity and a hunger to learn, and that hunger to learn just needs to be allowed to grow instead of squashed and tamed and smothered until it ceases to exist. This book is full of information through the lens of psychology on why education coming through the lens of play and through curiosity and through creativity is so beneficial, and why it works and why it's so detrimental to a child's emotional and psychological well-being to try to crush them into a mold that was never designed to serve them and was only designed with the convenience and the efficiency of running a national system as its North Star. My copy is full of notes and highlights, which you can maybe see, and I highly recommend this one. It's a fun read. Book number 10, I don't have a physical copy of it. I read the ebook version, is How the Other Half Learns by Robert Pondiscio, another previous podcast guest who was amazing to talk to. You would probably really enjoy that episode. I had a lot of fun recording it. In the book, Robert describes his experience as an investigative journalist, effectively, who spent time inside of one of the highest performing schools in New York City called Success Academy, which was outperforming some of New York City's most elite private schools on test scores while serving primarily minority and low-income families across New York. And Robert went into the school to figure out what they were doing and why they were seeing so much success. And the book is an exploration of what actually happens inside of the school culture, the school's approach to academics, how they hold both children and parents accountable to their highest standards, and how they keep the kids engaged and bought into the learning process to the point that they are consistently getting unprecedentedly high scores on their standardized tests, in spite of coming from parts of the city that historically have very low test results. It's a really fun read, but it's also really interesting because it flips the script on what people think is possible inside of public and charter schools. And it raises a lot of questions about why this school gets such disproportionately high results when so many other schools across the country have abysmal test results, and we just sort of accept that as being okay. Book number 11 is not a fun read like the others are. It's actually hard to get through, but I think it's a book that's worth recommending because I found it extremely enlightening, and I think it's a book that's at least worth parents being aware of and probably worth your time to read. It's called A Mother's Reckoning by Sue Klebold, the mother of the infamous Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators at Columbine High School. And this book tells a story of how Sue found out that her son was one of the perpetrators and how it was a complete shock to their family. They had no idea anything was going on. And it breaks down the things that were learned during the FBI investigation, both of what was happening in Dylan's personal life, but also that were happening in the school. And it's a really open and honest exploration of both what happened and also what Sue wishes in retrospect she had done and she had known to perhaps try to prevent some of the tragedies that unfolded. And while this is not a thing that is hopefully relevant to anyone listening to this and hopefully is never relevant to another parent ever again, these things happen, and it feels often inexplicable how and why they happen. And I think with these sorts of tragedies being such a part of the cultural milieu, I think this is an important book for parents to read because it both talks about what was happening inside of Columbine and why some of the students there weren't surprised at all that a tragedy of this magnitude happened, but also what was happening in the life of her son that made it possible for him to live such a double life where he was plotting something like this. And at the same time, he seemed so normal at home that none of his family knew that something like this was going to happen. It's a fascinating read. It's a heartbreaking read, but I think it's worth the time because it talks about a part of the culture that's very real for a lot of families and a lot of kids that we don't always find very nice to talk about, but is important to spend a little bit of time thinking about and trying to understand. All right. That was, once again, a lot of homework. Those books will take a while to get through, whichever ones you choose to read. I highly recommend reading all of them, honestly, but pick and choose whichever ones you find the most interesting. Go back to the last episode on book recommendations if you missed it. There are a lot more great ones there. And there are still more books on my education shelf that we have not gotten to. So maybe we will do another one of these at some point and go through even more book recommendations. But this should be plenty to hold you over for now. If there are books that you love that you think I missed, drop them in the comments below. I would love the recommendations. I am always adding to my education collection, so please send them my way. And otherwise, I will see you all next week.